Auxiliaries are words occurring before verbs in English that support them by providing extra grammatical information. We're going to go in depth into each of these in separate subsections. I just want to show them to you here and show off the auxiliary portion of it. So Carl has left the chat. The verb here is left. We're supporting it with a verb like has or had. So that's called an auxiliary. Those pickpocketers have stolen our wallets. So stolen is the verb here. Have is supporting it. This is perfect have. It has meaning. Again, we'll talk about it in that subsection. Progressive B, same idea here. Jimmy is eating. So eating is the main verb here, but is supporting it. I have been losing. Losing is the main verb. Been is supporting it. With emphatic do, so you want to emphasize something, this is the same idea. So he does leave. Leave is the main verb. Does is supporting it. Want is the main verb. Do is supporting it. Yes, I do want that one. So we'll see how this works in our structure, and we'll talk about each of these individually, so that way we can see them in depth and how they differ and what their meanings are. Progressive B is one of the first auxiliaries we'll take a look at, and that is going to create something, the progressive phase, that gives off aspect. So aspect gives off information about the completion or continuity of an event. So progressive B occurs when an action is ongoing. So I wish I was leaving. So that's an ongoing event. He can't always be winning. Winning is an ongoing event. And what we see for the progressive is it always takes a be form. So am, are, was, were, is, and the verb after it has an ing. So it's giving the verb after this ing. So we call that the progressive ing. So whenever you see an auxiliary progressive be, you have to find a verb with the ing after. Otherwise, you're not looking at an auxiliary progressive be, you're probably looking at something else. So, what does this look like in terms of the structure? Well, if we say was leaving earlier, what we'll do is we'll label the was as prog, because this is progressive, this is the continuous, that's its label, that's what it does. And that is going to build up into a progressive phrase. And what that progressive phrase is going to take is it can take a verb phrase as a complement. So if the verb phrase comes next, it'll take the verb phrase as its complement afterwards. So was leaving earlier. And the reason that we can do this is because we can replace this bit here, which is was doing so. So we know that this is a constituent. This is some sort of verbal element that can be replaced with doing so. So was doing so. So we see the same thing with the right one. Be winning these games. So be is the progressive. We see the ing on the verb for winning, just like we do with leaving down there. So this is a progressive, builds into a progressive phrase that takes the verb phrase as its complement. So that is the progressive phrase. You need to find the ing on the verb. That has to be something. So if you see something like, for example, was stolen, you have to be careful here, because this is not progressive. Why? Because there's no ing on here. We have a different ending. We have the perfect here. Sorry, not the perfect. Well, the past participle, which is going to give us a passive. So that's going to be a little bit different. We have to be careful about that. Just a little tip going forward. The auxiliary perfective have is another auxiliary that can occur before the verb. It's going to have its own category and its own phrase. And its meaning is that the action has been completed relevant or relative to some other point in time. And what you'll always find, so for instance, had left, had won, is you're going to find some sort of have verb, so a helping verb, and then you're going to have the main verb after it. And it's going to be in either an ENED or in an irregular form. So had left, or in the case of had won. So one there is the main verb, and then had is giving this extra support to one to say, okay, relative to some time in the past, he won by that point. He had won these games. So in the case of the structure, we have perfect hads for had left earlier. That's going to get the perfect label, build up into a perfect phrase that takes a verb phrase as a complement, a potential complement. So it's just like the progressive phrase. It literally works the exact same way. And the key with this is that you'll always see have, plus you'll see that ed, en, or irregular form. So maybe a good example would be had stolen. So had stolen the goods. We see had here, and then we see this en on stole. So that's the perfect phrase, but we can do better. We can mix these because a sentence can be perfect and progressive at the same time. The meaning gets a little bit more complex. People had been finding the money, so people had this continuous event of finding the money that completed prior to talking at some point in the past. A little bit hard to convey, but we can see this in action. So, had been finding the money. Finding is our main verb, and then we have two auxiliaries. We have the progressive been, and then we have the perfect have. They will always occur in this order if both occur. So it's always perfect, then progressive, then the verb phrase. So had been finding the money. We had, which is a perfect phrase. Then what's coming next is been, which is a progressive. So taking the progressive phrase. And then finally after that, we get finding, which is the verb. That's the V, and that's the verb phrase. So we can see this little chain of auxiliaries here. Call this an auxiliary chain if you want. What you'll also notice is that now the predicate label is on the perfect phrase. And that's because that's the main predicate in the sentence. That's where the predicate starts. So the predicate can move around. Sometimes it's a VP, sometimes it's a progressive phrase, sometimes it's a perfect phrase, and sometimes it's another type of phrase that we're going to see later in the section too. Now, one thing. Let's be careful here. Is it an auxiliary or a verb? Because all of these words can be both. So I have been sleepy versus I have been eating. In the case of I have been sleepy, this is just a verb. And the function is different. This is talking about a characteristic of me. So I equals sleepy. This isn't a continuous action at all. This has a totally different meaning. Compared to I have been eating, now we have an auxiliary, we have a continuous action of eating. I have a new car. Now this have is the meaning of ownership. This is just a verb. But for have purchased, this is now the perfective. And we see that ed, en suffix on the verb. Finally, I will do it. This is now an action. So this is the verb. While for I do want that, well, now this is supporting want. So do is an auxiliary, and its role is emphasis. So I do, in fact, want that. So we can be careful there, and structures will be different depending on which one you have. So I just want you to check to see which aspect the underlying phrases have. So perfect, progressive, both or none, and then the categories of the words. So pause the video, try it yourself, and now let's go. The morning of the following evening, Star Trooper Dave had been catching fish off the ship's port. So catching is a verb, being is going to be our progressive, had is going to be our perfect. So in terms of aspect, this is going to be perfect and a progressive aspect. Okay. Orangutans at the Seattle Zoo were fleeing the building today after patrons opened the cage. So fleeing is the verb. Were is going to be progressive. It's giving that ing to flee. So yeah, it's going to be progressive aspect. Once upon a time, a squirrel in a cat suit tricked a bunch of dogs into thinking he was a real cat. All I see is a verb here. I don't see had tricked. So there is no aspect on this one. There's none. Okay, this last sentence is a test to make sure you have a grasp on auxiliaries versus verbs. So this is just a verb here. It's not supporting some other verb. We don't see any verb with ed or en or irregular form afterwards. So once again, this one sentence has no aspect. The auxiliary do occurs when there is emphasis on the action, or when you're asking a question and there's no other auxiliary that could be moved to ask the question. So in the case of I do want these fried beans, we could just say I want these fried beans. But the do is there specifically for emphasis. So this is why this is an auxiliary, and for this one we just call it aux because of the two purposes it has. It has various meanings depending on the situation. So this will build up into an aux phrase as well, because uh, this might be a little weird, but if we change the tense around, we can make this work. I did do so. So this can work. With the present, it doesn't quite work, but you know, I did want these fried beans would be emphasis as well. So uh, usually appears on its own. So if there's a perfect or a progressive, it's not going to appear, and it'll appear right before the verb, or right before some sort of negation, like I do not want. So here we see do. This is going to be the auxiliary. It builds up into an aux phrase, which should be labeled appropriately as a predicate here. And that's going to go down to the VP for want these fried beans. Hopefully you're comfortable with these fried beans right now. The demonstrative these, acting as a determiner, fried, the adjective phrase describing the noun beans. So that's the auxiliary phrase. We're not going to take a look at it in questions in this course because that's more advanced. So let's take a look for these different types of phrases and draw some tree structures. So had smoked, did quit, have been restarting. So for had smoked, this is going to be a perfect that attaches to a VP. So that's the perfect phrase, VP, and a verb. So that's for had smoked. We can put had here, and we can put smoked down here. So that's going to be the first one. We have did quit. So let's do this one a little bit differently. Let's write down the words first and then build the structure from there. I like to do it both ways. So did is an auxiliary. That's going to build up into an auxiliary phrase, which takes a verb phrase as a complement and then verb quit. Okay, what about, let's move that one out of the way. And different color, have been restarting. So we have been restarting, which means we have a perfect have that's going to build up into a perfect phrase. We have the en on been, and that's giving the ing to restart. So this is going to take a progressive phrase, which has the progressive be, and that's going to take a verb phrase, which has the verb restart. So here we have the perfect have, progressive been, and then the verb restarting. So we get to see all of our actions here, all of our new categories and phrases. So what is the structure looking like so far? Could not have quickly run last week. Well, we've now added a new layer. We've now added the perfect layer. We can now deal with this. But how do we deal with could and not? Let's find out.